It takes a moment. It's setting up the webinar on YouTube now.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Guten Abend, and welcome to the room, which is on the Lampeter campus of the University of Wales, Trinity St David. And the live stream and the Zoom room is hosted by the Ruhr Universität in Bochum and the Kiris Center. We are here tonight to mark and celebrate the publication of the edited volume, Globalization and Transculturality from Antiquity to the Modern World, edited by Dr. Serena Altiero and Matthew Cobb. Matthew is one of my colleagues here at Lampeter. My name is Magdalena Orman, and I will be just briefly introducing the session. We have, it's wonderful to see all of the names I read on the blurb crop up among the participators, and I have the outstanding two in the room as well. It's very much an evening to celebrate you guys and to really highlight this publication. We will begin very shortly with Matt introducing a short talk on the underlying aim of the volume in terms of looking at the value of applying globalization and transculturality to the ancient world. Serena, you will follow that up with the aims and the wider contribution of the volumes, putting it in its scholarly context. And after that, we will hear snapshots from chapter authors as well. After that, we'll open up for a discussion. I'm sure you will want to feedback on each other's work, not least as well, and how it has all come together. So really, Matt, without further ado, would you like to cover and get us started? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing and introducing all of us, Magdalena. So welcome everybody. It's great to have you guys either here on Zoom or via the live stream, or if you're watching it this as a recording at a later point. I hope you find it stimulating and useful. I'm very happy to be able to get us kick-started with this book launch by thinking about the concepts that really underpin this book in a wider context. So in recent decades, there's been a great deal of interest in both public and academic spheres regarding what it means to exist in a highly interconnected world. And this is perhaps unsurprising, since this reality impacts on everything from people's livelihoods and their freedom of choice to their ability to travel and communicate, as well as their sense of place within the world. Popular awareness of these circumstances is clear from the spread of terms like globalization, a term which, although it can be traced back to the mid-20th century, really entered popular discourse from the 1990s. The term globalization, as it's understood, has not remained static. How the term globalization has been understood has not remained static. Indeed, there's no singular definition that exists among academics or commentators. Rather, many have adapted this umbrella concept for their own purposes. Some earlier critics of globalization decried its homogenizing effects, the increasing production of standardized vacuous goods, and the loss of local traditions and cultural practices. However, this potentially lopsided view has been questioned in more recent discourse. So while convergence in standards and practices can result from greater connectivity, these processes can also lead to a great deal of heterogeneity and diversity. When individuals, communities, and societies encounter new food items, products, technologies, languages, and beliefs, among other things, this can often lead to new and distinct outputs, sometimes blending elements of the local and the global. In numerous instances, such increased interactions and engagements can lead people to interrogate or reformulate their own identity. In others, it might engender resistance and the desire to reinforce or indeed reinvent the supposedly traditional. On a more pessimistic note, greater interaction and exchange do not always lead to the breaking down of barriers. Over the last decade or so, our political and social discourse seems to have become more polarized, or at the very least, our media outlets give us that impression. So we exist in a time when, for many, the means of communication and travel, pandemic aside, have never been greater or more effective than any point in human history. It's kind of interesting that these barriers, real or imagined, to dialogue, comprehension, and empathy seem to exist, or at least, as I say, our media discourse gives us that particular impression. And we might observe this manifestation in the forms of resistance we see to national or supranational organizations, the resurgence of nationalist sympathies, the so-called culture wars, ideas like the clash of civilizations, and concepts like cultural appropriation. Indeed, how cultural interactions take place has similarly been the source of much public and political discourse in recent decades. Concepts like multiculturalism are celebrated by some and attacked by others. Related but distinct concepts like inter and cross-culturalism presuppose the existence of multiple group identities within societies or regions. These concepts, while also kind of sort of intimating that, also encourage those who have articulated them to explore how particular groups interact, what conflicts, antagonism, cooperation, and mutual comprehension may exist. However, transculturality, the other major concept that features in the title of our book, in some respects, avoids this presupposition of barriers or indeed the highly problematic notion of original cultural purity, which can perhaps be intentionally or not implied by some of those other concepts. Rather, recent proponents of transculturality, drawing upon the earlier work of Fernando Ortiz, have sought to emphasize how culture is porous, malleable, and ever-shifting in nature. So, taking all of this in mind, taking all of this in stock, it's important to note, that while many of the aforementioned issues may generate distinctly modern symptoms, the underlying challenge of how individuals, groups, and societies respond to greater levels of connectivity and increased interaction have much greater historical depth. The movement of goods, peoples, and ideas are long-standing features of human existence. The growth of connectivity, as well as its fragmentation, have generated many opportunities, benefits, and harms. In these circumstances, individuals, groups, and societies have frequently needed to respond by adopting, adapting, and rejecting elements they perceive to be external. So just as in the modern world, we can identify the flip sides of increased connectivity, that's to say convergence, divergence, and new outputs, so too is this the case in various periods of human existence. It is possible to discover the spread of shared or similar practices, habits, beliefs, and material goods, yet at the same time, we can also identify an array of distinct and often localized outputs. In recognizing the historical depth of these issues, it encourages us to look for suitable analytical tools to study and articulate these phenomena. Many, although by no means all, I should stress, contributors to this volume would take the view or would argue that globalization and transculturality offers such tools. And here it should be stressed that our aim overall is not to try and place earlier periods within the so-called history of globalization, nor is our endeavor to identify past instances of globalization, as some scholars like Justin Jennings have sought to do. This is not to decry either endeavor, but they do remain in many respects secondary to our main purpose. Instead, we argue that concepts connected to globalization and transculturality have greater analytical utility. They can be used to help us critically evaluate and articulate the impacts of greater connectivity and engagement across the globe at various times in history. So the concepts are not wedded to any particular historical period. They have analytical utility in many different contexts. Other contributors will have more specific comments to make about how these concepts may be applied. But here I'll restrict myself to the observation that transculturality can help us move away from the idea of distinct, enclosed, and static notions of culture, while globalization can encourage us to consider local contexts within the frame of wider global networks. Moreover, these concepts encourage us to consider the creative agency of individuals and groups that are involved in these various processes. And with that, I will pass over to Serena.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. Thank you very much for passing the virtual microphone to me. Well, as Matthew just pointed out, the major aim of this book is mostly to examine the value of globalization and transculturality as theoretical tool for the study of interconnections across the ancient world. Our purpose was and is with this book to provide new insights into interactions and interconnection between distant regions. Key issues include the development of complex trade networks, spread of religions, diffusion of global fascism, migration of technologies, involvement of public and private initiative, and the inset of transculturality, as the title also states. By utilizing the theoretical tools of globalization and transculturality, we can consider the more complex, nuanced, and multifaceted way in which mobility of goods, migration of people, transfer of knowledge help to develop an increasingly connected world, without isolating local context from the global network and adding to the theoretical debate beyond disciplinary boundaries. This volume is actually multi and interdisciplinary, strengthening the understanding of issues that don't really fit into the existing divisions of academia nowadays. So trying to develop new practices, approaches, and opportunities. Moreover, this will be clear, also more clear later when our contributors will take the stage, that this book covers a wide geographic and chronological scope, spanning from Europe, East Africa, South Asia, Japan, and also chronologically from the Bronze Age to colonial time. Each chapter, while focusing on specific research areas, the ones bring into the discourse case studies mostly, they all aim at highlighting how the overall theoretical approach impacts on archaeological and historical research in a broader sense. Technology nowadays speeds up trade, communication, and exchange. But in this book, archaeologists and ancient historians demonstrate how, in diverse contexts, humanity constantly showed a huge and an incredible capacity to connect with distant people, with distant society, with distant lands. But what is important is that our contributors do not stop at tracking such connection. It's not just tracking trades. This work is devoted to the analysis of their cultural output. So what happens because of this? One of the key methodological points is that adopting concepts and methodologies from the study of contemporary societies adds value to the understanding of early human history. Just wanted to add a few words to who will read this book. So this is my ode to the readers. This book has been designed aiming at an academic public at a very time when, after what we can call a long formative phase, we are seeing a growth of global studies applied to archaeology and history. Now it's not something new anymore, it's something established. And we actually hope that this book is appealing to fellow scholars, not only in our fields, but also in neighboring fields, because as I said, we aim at being interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. This collective volume aims at being of interest to scholars focusing on different parts of the globe. So coming from area studies, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and scholars focusing on different historical periods. I want also to add something else, because after now it's less than a month that the book is out, but I really think that it can be useful for various university courses. So not only for the academic public in the aim of the researchers, but also to teach our students about these issues. Actually, I already used the introduction section in some chapters in my classes last week. So I know that it can work, and the students were very interested in it. So not only those courses that focus on the specific areas and topics can benefit from the sections, but well, my class was actually about religions and ancient globalization, was not about a specific area in general. So this book easily fits in a wide range of syllabi, global history, world archaeology, ancient religions. It really gives a lot of inputs also on the teaching side of view. So in general, I believe, and I think I can say we believe, that this can be a good read for many, because it provides a fresh point of view on global issues using the past also to understand our contemporary world. I will keep it short, and so the books, of course, falls in the current debate over the historicity of globalization as to the trends, to an increasing trend in the scholarly interest on this topic, global world history and archaeology, globalization, all the theoretical aspect of this. And so this should make it appealing on a way to the readers that I dedicate this ode to. So I will just stop chit-chatting about how I'm happy about this book, and I will pass the word to our contributors that will shortly present how the book is organized, presenting the various sections. And I go back to our cover, and our next speaker is Dario Nappo, that will say a few words on the first section of the book, that is the one about theory and methodology.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, fine, thanks. First of all, well, time is short, but I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to present this section of the book, a section I like very much, not just because, of course, I wrote one of the 2 chapters, but for the reasons I'm going to explain. Section 1, as Serena said, is about theory and methodology. And there are 2 contributions in it, one by Serena, From the Field to the Globe, the Archaeology of Globalization, and one by myself, Globalization as the Stage of Modernization. As the editors explained very well, globalization and archaeology, antiquity, pre-modern world are 2 concepts now that have quite an history in scholarship. So we cannot claim, of course, that this is a completely new idea to study globalization for the pre-modern world in general. And it is indeed true that over the last few years, a few books, basically more than a few, have appeared on this subject. And this, of course, for us is a good thing, because we had a lot of material to engage with in our discussion. But at least for me, what I found is that, especially in the most recent publications, the methodological issues and the theoretical issues about the use of globalization in a pre-modern world is completely skipped. So some of the especially edited volume on the subject, basically they go straight to the application of the theory of globalization to some specific cases without engaging with theory. So I think that this section is one of the merits of this book, because it puts on the table mostly the problems of using the globalization theory apply to other disciplines and the modern world. The two articles start from very similar premises, because they both focuses on how the globalization word came to be, try to analyze in which word it originated, and they both conclude that the birth of the concept of globalization has to be placed at the end of the 19th century, although, as Matt said, it became especially popular from the 90s of the 20th century. And both articles agree on the fact that basically globalization is a concept that originated from the economic and social analysis of the society, of the contemporary society, to mark the difference between the contemporary society and all the other societies that preceded it. Now, the first article deals with this very intriguing concept of the globalization of archaeology, and archaeology of globalization, that Serena tries to define, and is a very challenging act, basically, because as she aptly observes, the archaeology of globalization is a rather new concept. There is not a lot of scholarship of the subject. If one tries to find scholarship on the matter on Google or other research tools, all you can find is published stuff on either archaeology or globalization, or the two terms combined together. So she tries to put forward this new concept to explain why it's useful and all the problems, the issues related to the use of it, and is an extremely stimulating discussion. And the fact that in the end it's impossible to come out with a precise definition of it, I think is the best way to explain how these ideas are new and need further development and further discussion. So it's I suppose what research is all about. I mean, explaining not just what we already understood and have for granted, but rather, the new frontiers of knowledge. And that's what I think is the main contribution of this first part of the section 1. To me, very briefly, it's more complicated to talk about the second article, because it's the one written by me, but I tried to, in a similar way, to put forward some of the issues of using the concept of globalization with the pre-modern world. And I focused more on the risk of using globalization to create a modernized view on the past, which is, of course, one of the ways in which globalization has been used, basically to erase the difference between the contemporary world and all the pre-modern societies. So, all in all, because I think that pretty much my minutes have expired already, I am very happy that this book has this section, and I'm very honored to have been invited to contribute to this section, because I think that only with awareness of the and honesty about the pros and the cons about the use of new tools, new concepts, or not so new concepts, but used in a new way, only with this awareness is possible then to engage in a fruitful discussion about globalization and pre-modern world. And this introduction, this section 1, works very well for this. And as Serena said, I think it can be very useful as a didactic tool also to explain to students the complexity of studying the past, which is not something that we receive in a book, in a manual, in a bookshop, but it's something that we have to earn in a way. So I finish here, and I give the ball basically to the next speaker, and I thank again the organizers.
Thank you, Dario. Our next speaker that will present the next section, that is the one about Bronze Age globalization is Louise Steele, that wants to share some slides with us. So I will stop sharing the contents page. And yeah, okay. Louise, we cannot hear you.
Hi, sorry about that. I'd like to thank you all thank Matt and Serena for inviting me to take part in this book. And oh gosh, my PowerPoint went very quickly there. I greatly enjoyed writing it. I took a very different approach to, I suppose, many of the other ones. I've been playing around with the new materialisms over the last couple of years, and I thought it'd be quite interesting to take Delander's assemblage theory, or agencement, which is probably the correct term, and apply this to contacts and interactions in the late Bronze Age in the East Mediterranean. And it's very much more thinking about the movement of not just the goods that we see moving around, but trying to get the people back into the picture as well. So this is just a picture of the world that I look at. I work in the East Mediterranean, and my primary area of focus is late Bronze Age Cyprus, which is, because of its position in the East Mediterranean, involved in trade and exchange of the Aegean, Egypt, and the Near East, and to a much lesser extent with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. And what we see in the late Bronze Age is overlapping patterns of globalization and exchange networks. So there's an overland network connecting the Persian Gulf, southern Mesopotamia, going all the way up into Anatolia, and then there's other networks connecting the East Mediterranean, the Levant, Cyprus, and Egypt. And then you've got these sort of patterns of colonization on top, the Hittites up in the north, which is the big red blob, and the orange blob, which is the Egyptian Empire. So we've got all these overlapping networks of people moving around and objects moving around, and superpowers sort of overriding everything. So that's the background to where I'm working. And what I focused on was an article by Birnbeck where he talks about agencement or assemblage theory, and aligns this very much with Latour's actor network theory. And both of them, I think, work very well. I think they are distinct. And Birnbeck, in his discussion, talks about the main ports of trade, the palaces and the big ports of trade interacting with each other, and the mechanisms of trade, so the ships and the merchants and the writing mechanisms facilitating the trade. And then he had this interstitial space, these places in the background, which he saw sort of being behind the network or within the network, not part of the network. And I found that quite problematic, because I've been working at a site in central Cyprus, a place called Erethiou, which is a late Bronze Age farming community which supported the local copper mines. And copper trade, of course, is the backbone of the Bronze Age trade networks in the late Bronze Age. And I felt that Erethiou was just as connected into the networks of exchange as places like Enkemi or Ugarit or Knossos or Mycenae. So I felt that the productive places, the farmers and the metallurgists were just as much, and the miners were just as much part of this. And talking about agencement takes you away from separating people from things. So acting network theory sees things moving around and people moving around, but there's a sort of a binary between them, whereas agencement allows you to think about things and people moving around together, and it's multi-scalar. So there's no, you can go right the way down into the lipids in a pot, or the constituent parts of the clay that makes the pot, all the way up to the merchants who are moving stuff around, or the people in the marketplaces who are buying stuff. And so I think it allows for greater fluidity between all the different constituents of trade and exchange and globalization in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. So I felt it was quite a worthwhile approach to try and apply. So it's very much more about the flow of matter, and part of that matter is the flow of people. And the material that I focused on was imported material found at Eredio, and I've got some examples of it here, and there's some drawings in the book, but these are the lovely colour photos. So we've got Mycenaean pottery, Minoan pottery, Levantine pottery on the two sides, and also Egyptian pottery. And this is all flowing into the site, but it's flowing through the hands of multiple people, and multiple contents are flowing into and out of these vessels. So it was very much more, rather than trying to look at Eredio as a snapshot of the archaeological, the archaeological record snapshot, it was just thinking of Eredio as just being one stage in the movement of these goods, but the fluidity which is connecting the olive oil going into the spirit jar, and the spirit jar moving in the hands of maybe a Canaanite seaman, and ending up in one of the ports of Cyprus, and ultimately ending up at Eredio. And it's really trying to think of that fluidity of movement at different levels, from the people to the objects to what finally forms the archaeological record. So it's a very different way of thinking about globalization, but one which I found quite challenging. And I hope you enjoyed reading it, Serena and Matt, and I hope other people will find it quite fun to look at. It's very different to everything else, but I think it's quite a worthwhile approach to apply. So thank you very much. That's pretty much all I got to say.
Thank you, Louise, for your brief presentation and your contribution. I just wanted to ask Tibor, that also contributed to the Bronze Age section, if he wants to say a few words about his chapter, while the section is concluded by a chapter of an author that is, unfortunately is not here with us today, about Bronze Age Japan, but I would like to hear something about the Bronzization theory that Tibor puts out in his contribution.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the word. Thank you for organizing the conference and then publishing the book and taking all the work, doing the work. It was just great working with you. As for my contribution, the Bronzization is a specific part of the globalization that happens in the Bronze Age. Allegedly, it should involve most of the known world, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia at that point. And it expresses the way it entangles and connects peoples and materials. And then, in essence, it lays the basics for theory that people can later on apply in various fields in order to analyze how this interconnectedness of peoples and objects can localize differently in different parts of this world. And what I try to do in this chapter is to give a bit of theoretical background to explain how this can be specific for the Bronze Age, and hope that most people will be able to understand it and use it in their own research, or maybe even as a support for students.
Thank you. And now we pass to the next section of the book, that is Globalization in the Early Historic Indian Ocean, that will be presented by Troy, that is there in Lampeter. So,
good evening, Serena. Good evening, all. Can you hear me and see me? Okay. Yep. Excellent. I'll crack it. So just very briefly, I'd like to say thank you both to Matt and Serena as editors. You've done a fantastic job, and to the other contributors. It's been a fantastic experience. So I'll dive into to section 3. So there are many points of convergence across the chapters in part 3 of our volume. However, to my mind, as both a contributor and as a reader, 3 features seem particularly worth highlighting with regards to globalization and the early historic Indian Ocean. The first of these is their readability and their accessibility. To many, this is rightly an obvious point, and one which, as we have seen already tonight, is a feature shared by the volume as a whole. However, in the context of the chapters on the early historic Indian Ocean, it is one which, personally, I believe is worth re-emphasizing. This is because although globalization in the early historic Indian Ocean has been discussed by a few scholars in recent decades, it has tended to be quite ad hoc. More than this, prior discussions were largely unable to reap the benefits offered by recent scholarly developments, which we might refer to collectively as globalization theory. With such developments come not only a host of new and exciting intellectual avenues, but also a maze of terminological debates and new conceptual frameworks. Add to this the task of transferring and applying these distinctly modern concepts to the unique social, cultural, and economic environment of the early historic Indian Ocean, and the true extent of the challenge is revealed. Despite these challenges, these chapters do, at least in my view, and I hope those of my fellow contributors and the readers at large, successfully and accessibly take steps to start to bring these 2 important branches of thought together. The second feature is, of course, the important development in the scholarship on the early historic Indian Ocean, which these chapters represent. This region and period, circa 500 BCE to 300 CE, have seen a proliferation of scholarship over the last few decades, primarily relating to international commerce, although not that exclusively. The chapters of this section continue this trajectory by both reassessing and developing a variety of hypotheses using tools bequeathed by globalization theory. For instance, as we've seen from Matt already, the use of transcultural theory, at least in respect to the chapters of this section, to consider the potential use of Roman precious coins discovered on the Indian subcontinent, and also in another chapter, the symbolism of, or potential symbolism of, an Indian ivory statuette famously uncovered in the ashes of Pompeii. These are but 2 examples. And alternately, notions of globalization are used within this section to better contextualize prior attempts to incorporate globalization into the contemporary worldview of the Mediterranean denizens of the early historic Indian Ocean. The final feature of these chapters, which I wish to highlight here, is perhaps a third, and I promise, final cliche. Aside from their shared attempts to meld very modern concepts with a very ancient world, and their valuable contribution to an increasingly nuanced and expansive scholarship, often using similar methods and approaches, these chapters at their heart and their core tell a remarkable human story. Indeed, if you may indulge me on the briefest of personal anecdotes, this is the story of the early historic Indian Ocean is one which has kept me from leaving this period right the way through from BA dissertation to PhD thesis. It is the story of why a Roman coin might journey for thousands of miles from home, how transactions such as these created a cosmopolitan artistic culture in Central Asia, and why a figurine made of Indian ivory came to be embroiled in the most famous volcanic eruption in human history. As one Sunil Gupta puts it, whether it is the merchant ship sailing out from the Red Sea coast to the far ports of the Indian Ocean 2,000 years ago, or the SpaceX rocket blasting off into the ether today, human enterprise will remain that one consistent, pushing the frontiers of human imagination. Thank you very much all for your attention, and I'm delighted to hand over to the final speaker to present the book. Thank you.
Yes, now let's give the stage to Ashwini Lakshminarayanan that will discuss the last section of this book, that is Global Studies in Complex Historical Context, that includes some very interesting case studies.
So good evening to everybody here. I would like to quickly present the 3 chapters of the final section of this book titled Global Studies in Complex Historical Context. The common thread running through the last 3 chapters of this book is the focus on the local environment. They present complex historical context, the first focusing on how the ideology of the Dhamma was expounded by the Ashokan edicts relating to the new social structure in the 3rd century BCE against the backdrop of an increasingly connected Mauryan kingdom. The second establishes the connection between the art of Swat and Kizil in the 1st century CE as a product of the economic and political stability along the Silk Roads. The third and final chapter interrogates the material culture of Sao Paulo in the early modern period to understand the historical processes of Brazilian colonization and the European contact with indigenous people. Although the connection between the first and the second chapter may seem obvious to any reader, with their focus on early Buddhism in the Indic North and in the Indic Northwest context respectively, the relationship between all three warrants their place together in this common goal of giving prominence to local agency. The 3 chapters of this section contribute to the understanding of the impact of ancient globalization through distinct examples based on ideology, motives, and objects. They weave these examples to identify their place in the regional, local, and global context. So let's just jump right into them without any big spoilers. The first chapter underlines the role of Ashokan edicts in the Indic North and puts forward Buddhism as a form of ancient globalization. It brings attention to the way in which Buddhist-inspired Dhamma, referred to in the Ashokan edicts, seem to establish a new trans-regional identity to appeal to common ethos, and that which transcends regional and local affiliations. The second chapter highlights the relationship between Gandhara and Kucha artistic repertoires. It emphasizes the role of local agency in selecting from available artistic repertoires that were trans-regionally shared and locally adapted. The third and final chapter gives prominence to the local response to colonization and globalization through pottery morphology and decoration. It brings into context the relationship between colonizing European material and local pottery by setting out the multiple cultural ties that you can see here, for example, local, indigenous, African, Portuguese, etc. in the assemblage from 3 excavated sites in Brazil. Despite the variety of time periods and geographic locations and contexts, the 3 chapters successfully highlight the usefulness of deploying globalization theories to study ancient connectivity. They show that in order to understand complex connectivity processes at play, it is constructive to use an approach that moves away from simple acculturation and interpretation and towards local appropriations, integration, and cultural negotiation. To this extent, using the framework of globalization theory can not only reveal spatial ties within a region, as shown by the first chapter, but also helps us understand objects and relational terms evidenced by the second and the third chapter. Before the Q&A, I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the editors of this volume and all the authors who worked diligently on this book. I thank the other 2 authors for trusting me to summarize their work accurately, and everyone else who is present here to share this work with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Before leaving going back to the book, I would at this point invite comments or questions from the audience, both in person and online. The online audience can add their question to the Q&A box or signal in any way that they want to speak, and we will give them the power to do so. And also I would invite the other contributors that are here with us now, if they want to add something to what has been discussed already, feel free to open your microphone and add to our discussion tonight. I would maybe start asking a question to Matt. That, yeah, I know there's a. It's about what you presented to us tonight. And I just want to point out an important point that I always think deserves to be highlighted, that it's how increased and greater connectivity, beside and instead of leading to the so vituperated homogenization, can actually lead to a great deal of heterogeneity and diversity, that I hope it's something that is made clear also by the different contributors in this book. So I just wanted to invite you to add a few thoughts about this process and how it is implicated in the reformulation of identity that you mentioned, and how local traditions and local culture gains power and is reinforced in some context of globalization.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I mean, happy to kind of elaborate a little further on that. So, yeah, I think one of the key things that has really been elaborated in recent years when it comes to the concept of globalization, as I tried to highlight and as you reiterated, Serena, is this fact that it's very multifaceted. So it's not just about kind of homogenization, but in many respects, you've got a complex potential for adaptation, amelioration, resistance, rejection, in a variety of complex ways that can often lead to people consciously engaging with what might be seen as external or appropriating it in various ways for their own use. I mean, in regards to your own work, I think it's particularly valuable the way that you pointed out the how imagery and potentially even kind of typological significance of best figurines from Egypt, best terracotta figurines, can find a wholly new purpose in a Central South Asian context. So the potential for some of the imagery that originally connects to some of this best imagery can essentially be repurposed in an entirely distinct South Asian context for a new distinctive representation of Yaksha figurines. So that's, you know, just one example among numerous that could be emphasized. On the question, I suppose, of diversity and identity, I suppose one of the points that I think is always useful for us to reflect on is while globalization and transculturality are really useful tools for thinking about how we understand the mechanisms of culture and of interaction between different groups and individuals, the way we analyze it doesn't necessarily completely map onto the way that the peoples in the past, or indeed in the present, understand themselves and their own identities. And that's as true in the past, I think, as it is in a modern context. So for your study, when you've looked at some of these Yaksha figurines from the Deccan region, for example, I mean, I'm not sure to what extent we'd be able to answer that question, but whether individuals would necessarily have understood themselves to have, I mean, they wouldn't have articulated in that way that something transcultural is going on, and they may not even necessarily have thought about the use of these figurines in the way that we articulate it. They might see that as kind of distinctly local and traditional. And we can probably think about that in a modern context as well, that while we can talk about processes of globalization and localization and transculturality with regards to culture, nevertheless, people's groups, societies may often end up adopting and adapting and changing elements that, for lack of a better term, not necessarily being originally indigenous, although that's not really going to be a very helpful way to phrase it, but they might incorporate some of these elements and just produce something distinct and local, but they potentially might perceive that as being quintessentially part of their quote-unquote traditional identity and culture. So I think that there's something that's useful there to kind of keep in mind, that there can be a dissonance between the way that we can utilize concepts like globalization and transculturality to both understand the modern world and also study the past. But that doesn't necessarily always actually map on to the way that people understand their own identity and the way that they express themselves. So I think that's a point that's useful to get across, and I think we tried to get across that a bit in the introduction there. That would be the additional point that I would have to make in regards to that. But I will stop talking now so that we can get more questions if anyone wants to ask further questions or follow that up.
I cannot see if there are questions from the live public, otherwise I have another question.
Are there any questions in the chat, Serena?
No, but I actually have a question to Marcelo that should be here, and I invite to take the word, because from the latest presentation, we see that his chapter falls a bit isolated in the section. Of course, I also have to admit that there were more chapters that fell victim of the pandemic, I must say, at this point, since this book has been written during 2020. So I just wanted to ask Marcelo if he wants to add something on how actually his book really fits the discourse that is taken over in this book, and if he wants to add something on how such concept fit his study context that is so different from the others in his section, and complete the discourse that we want to take over in this book.
Hang on, Serena, just wait a second. Let me just unmute this. And actually just in a second.
Yeah. I'm making a bit of surprise question to the contributors, so I hope now you're not all scared.
Yeah, sorry, because actually there's just I am currently at work. I'm in the office actually. Just wait a second. I'm just unmuting this. Yeah, but no, it's that thing on the global time. Actually, it was very interesting for me to write this chapter in such a varied, with such a great variety of contexts and well, context and locations and time periods and everything. But I thought it was very interesting to add that my chapter, especially when we bring actually colonial times, that is actually when well, how can I say this? People usually think of globalization, especially when there are the great navigations and future colonial times, when it's mostly historically documented. And it was interesting for me to bring on the effects of those great navigations inside ceramics, when we managed to watch the influences that had in indigenous production and African American production, African American production, and European production as well. And it was for me very interesting to put this on in this new perspective. Since I believe in the conference that we had in 2019, this perspective for me wasn't so well developed. So I managed to read some more and get in touch with the new concept of bringing localization into the picture, and I think it was a very nice experience, and I hope everyone that reads this chapter, and I've already actually had colleagues from Brazil that wanted to read the book and read my chapter, because this discussion is not very well spread in Brazil. And well, I guess that's it. I don't really have much to add, but actually just to thank everyone involved in bringing this book on, and just let's hope that that information gets widespread, and it becomes an interesting discussion for future works.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. We are almost running out of time.
Serena.
I don't know if Matthew has something to add.
I know, Serena, I think it's just that a chat has come up from a Dylan in the message. So there is actually a question from someone from the audience. I'm not sure if you can see that in the chat.
Well, yeah, now I can see it. Okay. You mentioned that the study of contemporary society could be highly relevant to, I would give you power of speaking, just a second, so that you can pose your questions.
Yes, hello.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentations. It's very interesting. I just had this question. You mentioned the relevance of the study of contemporary society for the research on the ancient world. And I was wondering if you might like to elaborate with an example or several examples on how you would apply research on contemporary society to the study of the ancient world.
Okay, I'm on. Yes, I mentioned this point because mostly the focal point here is that most of the theories we use to discuss globalization in the past and complex connectivity in the past are borrowed by studies on the contemporary world, in particular on the world as it is now after the 80s. Mostly because, as also Matthew pointed out, with the concept of globalization, even if its origin is somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, really gained an audience and gained power around the 80s. And it was first elaborated as a mainly economic concept, and was used to study the contemporary society, in particular those that we clearly see as global phenomena related to what was the corporate age, so the age of the great corporation spreading around the world. Starting from observing the kind of research, so let's use a word that is maybe well known to many, this McDonaldization. Something resonated also to us dealing with the ancient world and trying to define the concept of globalization. We ended up finding a way to see it also in the past, that it's especially the main issues that in the pre-modern world we cannot carry on quantitative research, so with the optic of the economists mostly, but we need to rely on what we are lucky enough to be able to see. So we have to look for nuances and consequences, and what is mostly a qualitative assessment of what is globalization. So in this sense, it's how the study of contemporary society has been relevant to the past and keep being, because as this set of knowledge or this set of theory revealed to be useful to understand the past, at the same time this can proceed in this way and can have also further developments in the future. I hope I answered this question. And I don't know if Matt wants to add something or other authors.
I mean, yeah, no, I'm happy to add something to that. So yeah, I think the key point that I hoped I sort of stressed in the introductory bit is that while while we can think of symptoms of globalization in a modern context, or expressions of it from, you know, intercontinental travel by planes or the internet, or indeed things like Zoom, those are symptoms of globalization in a modern context. And really what we've hopefully tried to do is thinking about the way in which concepts from that can allow us to explore more underlying facets of the human condition. So there, as Serena mentioned, there's a bunch of social scientists in particular that have articulated what we might think of as concepts that fall under the umbrella of globalization or globalization. So things like vulnerability, what happens when you get increasingly more interconnected and increasingly more interdependent, what could be the consequences of that, particularly when it comes to the collapse of those systems. Things like deterritorialization, how does increasing connectivity, for example, allow us to think about how people view themselves in connection to their immediate neighbors, but other people much further away. And I often think diaspora, community in historical contexts are good examples of this. So obviously they could not travel and communicate in the way that we could in the modern world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't presented with some of the same issues about how do they relate. For example, if you were a part of the Jewish diaspora of Kerala, how did your sense of identity and your connection with your neighbors, how did that operate with regards to your potential sort of religious affiliations, your language, what you're doing in South Asia? Might you feel potentially stronger bonds and connections with, say, some of your fellow merchants in Egypt, even if you spent a long time living in South Asia? So you can think about things like deterritorialization and sense of identities. Heterogeneity, again, a concept we mentioned, where how even with increased interaction, you can often actually get a sort of quite a notable plethora of distinct outputs that come as a result of this. So really, I guess the key thing is that even though we tend to think of globalization in a modern context, often the things we associate it with are really the symptoms. And what we're trying to do is actually take some of these concepts to sort of explore underlying aspects of the human condition in the past that particularly result from greater connectivity, greater engagement, the greater need to attempt to or fail to comprehend each other. So I suppose that would be something I would hope to add to. That's something I would add to that question that was asked then. There are almost like innumerable examples we could give, but I think if I did that, we'd be here all night. So I will refrain from doing that. But if any other contributors want to kind of add to that, that would be good. Actually, I don't know whether not to kind of put Dario on the spot here, but I think of many of the chapters, Dario is possibly slightly more skeptical of the way in which globalization's concepts might be used. So from that kind of slightly more skeptical perspective, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add there, Dario.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but yes, I think that this issue has to be developed, a little bit more, because I always feel modernization is one of my constant ideas, that we have to keep the distance between the contemporary world and whatever came before it. And that, but of course, I totally agree that we live in the contemporary world and we see the world with contemporary lenses. So we also see the past with these lenses, and I think it's pretty much fine if we use them, as long as we realize that we are wearing them. That's the main point. That's why in this kind of studies, we need a lot of theoretical debate to reach basically a common ground and understanding of what we are doing. And that's why I think it's so important. And I'm gonna say, highlighting the issues that we have doesn't mean, to me at least, that we don't have to tackle the problem. We do have to tackle the problem, to have to face the risk of modernizing when we use globalization. But again, we have to be aware of this risk. And in this way, at least we are honest in doing it.
Thank you, everybody. And
may I just make one short observation from the audience as well? And I won't even try to make it a question. This will be unashamedly a comment, in that one of the things that really stood out to me in your introductions, Serena, was the emphasis that you all put on finding common ground for apparently diverse historical and archaeological inquiry. And I remember that from attending the EA panel that was also at the root of this edited volume, in that you all, and that has come up in the discussion now as well, come from very different departments. You have your homes in different academic departments, let alone, of course, in different places around the world. And in that sense, I think it is particularly important to find the meeting places where you who have an active interest in globalization, not so much in terms of the history of globalization, as Matt said, but rather as a toolkit for you to come together. And I hope that we soon can be back to meeting properly, both online and in person. But given the diversity of the discipline and given the diversity of your work, of your different locations, I think this event has been really useful and is a really useful pattern to follow. So thank you very much for bringing that together.
Thank you for pointing out this, because I really think it's a strong point of this group of people that worked on this book. And so really thank you for pointing it out in this occasion. If there are no other questions or comments, I think we can close this meeting. We're already like 10 minutes late. I thank you all for joining us. I don't know if Matt or Madeline wants to add something to the public there in Lampeter. And thank you again, everybody, for being here. And you will find this webinar recorded. So
I know all I would add to what you said, Serena, is just to thank everyone that participated in the production of this volume, everyone that's come today to share in the book's launch. And I really enjoyed the process of working with everyone, having fruitful discussions about these concepts. And I hope, as I'm sure everyone else does, that they can provide something useful for people, in a variety of different disciplines, coming from interested in a variety of different historical periods, tools or points of interest that people can think about, reflect on, build on. So that's just what I would add, and to thank everyone again for coming. And thank you very much, Serena, for all the hard work that you put into the volume.
Well, thank you, and you also for all the hard work you put into the volume.
Cheers, thank you.
We can shake hands on a distance. And thank you to all the contributors. Good work.